and welcome to the Bloomberg Davos debate. I'm Francine Lacqua. Well, for the next hour, we will be discussing some of the major economic issues facing the world with our illustrious panel. But we start with the fast and loose money that is sloshing around the world and the tensions that it's creating, a phenomenon some are calling currency wars.
Remains undervalued.
The yen is misaligned.
Many do consider their currency as a weapon.
These policies have the effect of keeping the Chinese currency substantially undervalued.
What we want is that the US value their currency and not devalue their currency.
Is there a war between the dollar and the yuan? Is there going to be a breakthrough? It's not what I'm most focused on.
This exchange rate flexibility, in our view, is very, very much in the interest of China.
The days of Chinese low-value added exports are over.
Well, now let's get straight to our panel. An impressive lineup from the financial world. The CEO and President, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Mr. Brian Moynihan. We have two central bankers, Stanley Fischer from the Bank of Israel and Mark Carney from the Bank of Canada. Two ministers of finance, Poland's Jacek Rostowski and Turkey's Mehmet Şimşek, as well as noted economic historian Niall Ferguson, who teaches at both Harvard University and Harvard Business School. Thank you so much for joining us. Neil, I actually wanted to kick off with you. We're hearing, of course, about currency wars. Some are refusing the term altogether. But is it actually a reality that until we get very good growth, there will be protectionism and certain countries will want to manipulate the markets?
Well, I think the phrase currency war is warranted. After all, it's the title of a best-selling book in China right now. So it's certainly a reality in what is now the world's second largest economy. The nature of the war, though, I think is widely misunderstood because it's often represented, and it was in one of your video clips there, as a war between the US and China. I think that's not the case. I think if anything, if there is a currency war, it's between what I call Chimerica, China and the United States, and everybody else, particularly some of the other emerging markets, which are finding that their currencies are strengthening while the China, pegged more or less to the dollar, isn't in the same way as it clearly should be. I mean, if market forces were given a free rein, there's no question, and I don't think anybody here would deny it, that the RMB, the Chinese yuan, would be a stronger currency.
Minister Şimşek, your country, of course, relies a lot on exports. Do you feel that there's too much intervention on the markets in general?
Well, certainly there is. I mean, I think on one hand you have got China attempting or trying to keep currency competitively undervalued. And on the other hand, you have obviously Fed flooding the world with dollars. So countries like Turkey are suffering simply because we have to deal with excess liquidity, and it complicates monetary policy, and certainly it does create difficulties. We are now implementing an unconventional, let's say, monetary policy. We're lowering rates aggressively, but at the same time, to prevent loan growth getting out of control and overheating, we're actually raising reserve requirements also very aggressively. Plus, we are introducing some form of uncertainty to the exchange rate market. So the difficulties are there. I mean, we are competing with China on many of products to European market, so competitive undervaluation is certainly a big problem for us, and U.S. and other, easy money policy elsewhere is creating also difficulties.
Stanley Fischer, a lot of economists blame both the U.S. and China for these global imbalances, and certainly when it comes to the U.S., some say, well, when you put so much cash out there on the markets, QE2, you have to think of the consequences for everyone around the world. Does the U.S. need to be more careful?
I think the prime responsibility of the U.S. is to get its economy back to growth at a reasonable rate, and its fiscal policy is extremely expansionary, and its monetary policy needs to be as expansionary as possible. Any time a country reduces its interest rate, more capital tends to flow into other countries. That's part of the adjustment mechanism. I don't think this QE2 was an attempt to weaken the dollar as much as an attempt to get domestic growth started. And I've said that faced with a choice as a central banker between a situation in which it's comfortable for us and the U.S. is growing slowly, and B, a situation in which the U.S. is growing rapidly and we have some problems dealing with our exchange rate, I take situation B any time, because the U.S. economy is coming back to growth as the essential change we need in the global economy.
Mark Carney, you second that?
If I'm given a binary option, absolutely second it. And let me put this in some context. I mean, bar China, we are the largest trading partner of the United States. We're the most integrated financial system with the U.S. And we entirely understand why the Fed has pursued the monetary policy that they have. They needed looser monetary policy. They took those steps. And let's just also put this money, quote, sloshing around into some context. Capital flows to emerging markets are still 2 percentage points of GDP lower today than they were in 2007, pre-crisis.
And yet we talk about asset bubbles. Brian Moynihan, how does that impact the way that you do business? We talk about these global imbalances. We've been talking about them, frankly, for the last decade. But now it seems that they're getting worse because of the crisis.
Well, I think two things. One is I think the economies of the world and the U.S. role in that as a major economy, and particularly the role of the U.S. consumer, the affluent consumer, and the purchase power and the consumption power, is something that I agree from a central banker standpoint, you need to get that rolling at a modest, a reasonable growth rate. And I think most of the decisions made in the U.S. are to make sure that there's no air to the downside and keep the upside inflated. As we look around and hear our clients talk about doing the business around the world, there's been a fundamental change over many years now that's really coming to bear, which is, multinational companies can do business anywhere. And the U.S. is in a position where they're competing for labor, getting their labor back to work against economies all over the country and consumption all over the world. And so it's a more difficult thing to solve, to get the unemployment down and other things in the U.S. So I think the Fed and the Federal Reserve and the policymakers have been doing their best to make sure this economy stays gliding along, and we're seeing it grow and we're seeing consumption come up. And I think that's critical, because that will help straighten out the imbalances just with that. And then our companies, because they can be so fluid in the global economies, have more choices. And I think long-term the U.S. has to have a good fiscal policy, good tax policy, and those companies then will locate their people all over, including the U.S. But right now, some of the advantages are to go other places.
Jacek Rostovsky, how worried are you about the global economy in general and the fact that we actually can't really deal with these global imbalances?
Well, I think the global imbalances were a very major cause of the problems that brought us to the crisis. But I agree with Stan Fisher that what people call currency wars today, people call competitive devaluation today, in the way in which the Federal Reserve is conducting its policy, is actually not the problem, it's the solution. And if we go back to Ben Bernanke's famous book on the Great Depression, that's when he pointed out that Keynes had actually got it completely wrong. What the 1930s exactly needed was a lot of devaluation down of gold. Well, we're not on a gold standard, we've got a completely different system, but the equivalent of that today is the kind of quantitative easing that we're seeing from the Fed. But, and this is my only quibble, if the United States has got a problem, it's a medium to long-term problem on the fiscal side, and it may need a slightly tighter fiscal policy, but I don't think it needs a tighter monetary policy.
If I could, may I just come in on that, because I entirely agree. And what we see now is the reverse of what happened in the 1930s. I say this with hesitation with Neil here, but instead of having that series of devaluations for the countries most affected, because of the interventions, there's this sort of death grip on the U.S. dollar, which is preventing the adjustment of currencies. And part and parcel of that is the monetary policy of the U.S. is being applied in countries where it's totally inappropriate.
But this is above all China, and it's a question of the kind of currency regime that they have, which, well, that's their currency regime. Maybe we can move on to that later.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the 1930s, it's clear that we learned from history in two pretty big ways, and that's why we're not in a Great Depression now. In fact, we're in a mood of near euphoria here at Davos, I think rather overdone euphoria in some cases. We threw massive fiscal stimulus at the problem instead of trying to balance budgets, and there has been enormous monetary stimulus from most of the major central banks. And QE2, quantitative easing 2, is just a fancy name for more monetary stimulus. The problem is that not everybody can have a weak currency simultaneously. And in this game of competitive devaluation, it's very clear that the Chinese are winning and have been winning for some time, with estimates of the undervaluation of the order of 30, 40, even 50%. I think that's the problem for the emerging markets that are seeing large appreciations in real terms of their currencies, and it's been a problem for Brazil, it's been a problem for Indonesia, and so on. For them, the adjustment is essentially being passed from China and America to their economies, and that is a very dangerous thing. The other problem, which again differentiates us from the Great Depression, is that we are letting the inflationary genie out of the bottle. Now, there is a view, which is still very prevalent in the United States, that there's no inflation risk because of all the slack in the economy. I think this is misplaced, because much of this slack in the labour and capital market is actually dead wood, and it won't come back on stream as the economy recovers. Looking at commodity prices, the big scare from the point of view of emerging markets is double-digit inflation in food prices. And we know that that's not just economically disruptive, it can be politically and socially disruptive too. My worry is that Fed policy is now the monetary policy of the whole world. And what is sold to American voters and indeed to the wider public as a solution to the problem of unemployment in Michigan ends up being a cause of major problems in commodity markets around the world.
Brian, is there a concern actually that the world is now addicted to this cheap money, whether it be through fiscal policy or monetary policy or QE2?
Well, I think Neil just talked about that. There's a worry always that you get used to this interest rate environment and you get used to it and cheap money and et cetera. But I think the real question is America has a near-term and long-term problem. The near-term problem is how do we stabilize the economy and what's gone on in the last couple of years. The long-term problem is we've had a fundamental move of manufacturing jobs out of our country for many decades, and we've got to create the new jobs of the future, and that's a longer transition. And we got to get our fiscal house in order. And so that, I think, there's no question our currency long-term reflect the strength of our country. And until we get our debt and everything in shape, the issue is we can't do that now and actually do what we need to do, some of the other colleagues have talked about here, to keep the economy going and keep the world going. So this is a short-term, long-term question. And I think you can overread where we are today because we couldn't err to the downside. But I think there's an absolute recognition long-term that we've got to get the fiscal house in order, which will then take care of a lot of the issues we're talking about.
Stanley Fischer, are you concerned that actually China, on the other hand, is overheating and that there's too many steps being taken to cool down the economy?
Well, there are lots of reasons, particularly in the housing market, to think that China is overheating. But every year that you come to Davos, there's some problem in China which is about to cause it to blow up, and somehow the next year you come, there's another problem that's about to cause it to blow up. You have a group of very smart policymakers there who've done very well in dealing with a variety of problems, including the potential collapse, which we were worried about 2 years ago. So I suspect they'll take measures to cool down the economy, and perhaps they'll only grow at 9% this year instead of 10%.
Mark Carney, how difficult is it to be a central banker today?
It's a lot easier than it was 2 years ago. No, I mean, these are serious issues, and I would pick up on the commodity point that Neil made. Take it from an advanced economy perspective, we have to hold our nerve through what are potentially one-off shocks for commodity prices. And look through that and manage inflation, monetary policy appropriately. The dysfunctional nature of the international monetary system is complicating our job without question, but we can still achieve our targets, and we are doing so.
We had George.
Just to come back to the point that Neil made about non-Chinese emerging markets having a problem with price inflation and food inflation in particular. If that's the case, then currency wars are the solution again. They can let their currencies appreciate and they'll have less of an inflationary problem. I mean, it really isn't news to anyone that every country has a short-term trade-off between inflation and economic activity. I think one of the, I think we all know that, and there is possibly an additional longer-term problem for the West versus the rest, in that with industrial activity and economic power shifting particularly to Asia, it may be the case that the West will have to get accustomed to paying more for various commodities. But on the other hand, the supply elasticity of many commodities will probably in the medium term be a lot higher than we imagine in the short term.
Mr. Şimşek, we had George Soros actually saying that the commodities will continue rising, but it's just a bubble for the next 2 years.
Well, it's probably less of a bubble. It's probably to do with how China goes from here. I mean, if Chinese growth remains as strong as it has been, along with India and other big emerging markets, there is underlying demand. There may be some, issues to do with trading of some of these commodities in certain exchanges, but ultimately you need to have underlying demand. I kind of disagree with some of the stuff that is said here, because China has accumulated, is now heading towards $3 trillion of reserves. Clearly, there is manipulation. Regardless of the U.S. intentions, the implications for many emerging markets and other countries have been very significant of what Fed has done or what other countries are doing. So there is certainly a problem. We did not import U.S. houses, but U.S. housing market problems turn out to become a major global issue for everyone. So I think if they could come up with a credible fiscal policy, I'm not talking about tightening today, but at least a credible medium-term fiscal framework, that might help. I think that applies to many other countries. So certainly it's very difficult to, at the early stages of the global crisis, during the at G20 level, there was a lot of talk of coordination. Now that a global sort of, let's say, recession, a problem that was contained rather than leading to a global depression, I think now everybody is going their own way. I think that's an issue, that's a problem. Global imbalances are there and probably going to grow, and I think if everybody pursue the type of policy they are doing, we will have to take measures. And many countries are doing. Brazil is taking measures, Israel is taking measures, Turkey is taking measures. So whatever you call these, whatever you name it, is in one format or another, there is something going on.
Brian, does this actually change the way that again, you talk to your clients for the foreseeable future?
Well, I think we reflect more on what our clients think and talk about and do, and they seek opportunity around the world, and then we build our business model to serve them. So, I think that the reality is the demand that's building up in Asia and stuff leads a lot of our multinational clients to have 70% of their revenues outside the United States, and 30 or 40% they're following the demand curve for infrastructure and computers and software services and all that stuff, and that's where the demand is, and that's where the people are going. Much like over the course of a year in demand for our investment banking services, we're flat headcount. We have 1,000 more people in Asia than we at the start of the year, so we're driving that. So I think it causes you to think about where you put people and resources, and human beings are our resources, where you put capital, where you participate in the markets, and then where you help create capital markets so that the funding can go on. And then from the client side, it really is down to, a lot of people think housing was a problem in the United States. There was actually a much longer-term problem. Housing actually covered it up for a while because it created an activity. That's now gone. And what you're seeing is the soft underbelly of years of decline of manufacturing jobs that we're going to have to figure out if we can stop or not. And our economy is dealing with that. And so our high unemployment rate and stuff is not because of housing at this point, because consumption is back to where it was in 2007. It's because underlying that we don't have the manufacturing base, and we have to figure that out as a country. That will be on American companies' minds as we move forward, now that we're through the worst of it.
Let me make a basic point, and it goes to the Minister's point on adjustment. There will be adjustment. Given the scale of the economic miracle in emerging markets, and it's very welcome, there is going to be real appreciation of these currencies. If you look back since 2000, the BRIC country currencies versus the G7, they've appreciated 5% in real effective terms, minor, even with recent movements. China, back since 1990, versus the U.S., it has not appreciated in real effective terms. So there is going to be this adjustment. It's going to move, and it can move on the nominal exchange rate, or it can move through inflation differentials. And just to bring it back to what Brian was talking about, from a client perspective, from a business perspective, it's much more attractive if it happens in an orderly fashion, if it happens in an element of price stability, both in emerging markets and in the developed economy.
And I think going back to how hard your job is, Mark, that's the judgment. Is how do you keep it, and from a business perspective, that's what we all watch, is can they keep it rational in the movements, not touch the third rail, keep it going. And that's the difficulty, and that's what makes your job difficult, is to manage that going down the tracks without touching either side of it.
Just to come, also come, oh, sorry, Stan, go ahead.
When Minister Şimşek talked about coordination, in the fall of 2008, it was very easy to coordinate policy because every country agreed to expand fiscal policy. Well, when all you have to do is spend more money and everybody else agrees that's a good thing to do, you can coordinate. Now we're at a stage where some people have, in essence, to forego some growth in order that others may grow a bit faster. Getting coordination on that is a totally different sort of problem and much harder to solve, and that includes the problem of global imbalances. Second point on whether we have a bubble in commodity prices or not. You can always have a bubble. We certainly had one just before the Lehman case with the price of oil and so forth. But given what the increases in demand for commodities from Asia, particularly from China and India, it is very likely that relative prices of commodities will rise for quite some time. That will not be a bubble, and we're going to have to find ways of deciding how to accommodate that, whether to let it go through into inflation or whether to try and push down inflation nonetheless.
Yes, I'm entirely. That was the point I was trying to make about the shift of power towards the West, and I agree with you entirely on that, Stan. Coming back to the point that Minister Şimşek made about currency manipulation, it's like the old joke about if you owe the bank $1 million, you've got a problem. If you owe them $1 billion, they've got a problem. Well, in a similar way, if a country has $3 trillion of reserves, that's not currency manipulation, that's an exchange rate regime. And the question is whether that exchange rate regime is sustainable. And if it isn't, then we're going to have a very major problem somewhere down the line. I have no reason to suppose it's not sustainable, but that's really the $3 trillion question.
Is it sustainable?
Well, I think there are two questions that we need to address as well before we get to that one. One is whether the dollar is going to continue to be the international reserve currency if policy